Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm doing a video today on my ciprofloxacin fluoroquinolone adverse reaction, and the topic that I want to do today is PTSD and CPTSD. I did a video just a few days ago at the 8-month mark that covered complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but I realized that this was a topic that is highly relevant for me, and I think for some of the folks that I've come across in the forums and the web pages online and people that I've made friends with that were adversely affected by these antibiotics. So I want to do another video about PTSD and complex PTSD, maybe look at what makes those two different, and then talk a little bit about how that translates into our experience as people who had a reaction to an antibiotic drug as opposed to somebody who had some sort of physical or sexual trauma or combat trauma or near-death experience through something sudden like a car accident. This is a bit different for us because of the fact that in many cases it had a gradual onset. Some of us it happened pretty quickly, but for some of us the symptoms developed over the course of days or weeks following, and in some cases they could be manifesting months or years later. And this is consistent with the research about fluoroquinolone's effects in the body, and that it's a mitochondrial disorder. So really we don't know what we're dealing with on an individual basis. It's different for all of us, and there's certainly a lot of uncertainty surrounding this condition, and I think in some ways that's what makes this, easily as bad as some sort of a sudden trauma like a car wreck or combat, or physical life-threatening trauma, a natural catastrophe like an earthquake, something that scared the bejesus out of you. This is something that maybe did scare the crap out of us, right? But it can be something that keeps scaring us, like every day, or maybe every week, or every so often. Maybe sometimes it gets better, sometimes we have a flare-up and it gets worse. But the fact is, when people are done with the car accident, when people come back from combat, now I'm not invalidating what they went through, and I believe that those are severe traumas, and I have, a great deal of compassion for people that have undergone any kind of trauma. But I just want to make sure that we are in the discussion as people who have had these psychiatric and physical symptoms due to an antibiotic, a very common mainstream antibiotic. So let's jump in then. What's the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, CPTSD? So I discussed this a little bit in the past video. It's duration. A complex post-traumatic stress disorder is typically something you may consider it a bit less lackluster, a bit. It's a little more about, for example, childhood developmental traumas and things like that, or people that were in abusive relationships for years, and there was a consistent series over a long period of time, months or years, which may include, but may not necessarily include, a sudden shock, a sudden trauma. There could be a lot of mild or moderate traumas sustained over a period of time, which is certainly consistent with those of us experiencing reaction to these antibiotics, because I'm over 8 months now, and I continue to have a lot of symptoms consistent with trauma. This is all, exclusive to, or I don't really want to separate the psychological and mental phenomena from the biological effects of the drug, but at some point we've got to begin to look at this holistically, and that includes a psychological approach. And a lot of these symptoms that I'm experiencing and becoming aware of, and that I've become aware of in people that I've befriended who have gone through this condition, is a form of trauma. So complex trauma is duration. Typical PTSD You often see that in people, first responders, people that were in car accidents, people that were in life or death experiences, rape, robbery, combat, things like that. Now, I think that many of us who had this poisoning from these antibiotics could also easily be diagnosed with PTSD as well, not just CPTSD. Complex trauma, at any rate, isn't formally recognized in the DSM, but it will be used informally within the community, and it will inform treatment approaches for the individual. Really, you could call it either one for us, but certainly PTSD is relevant for many of us. PTSD is typically more reserved for those big traumatic events, so big life or death threatening events. And many of you here watching this video and who have followed my channel and who are going through this certainly understand that this was a life or death situation in many of our experiences. Literally, it was life or death. We were having tachycardia, our hearts felt like they were about to explode, we were hallucinating, our body temperature was dysregulated, we couldn't feel hot and cold, or we felt hot when it was cold, or cold when it was hot, things like that. So very, very strange, extremely disturbing symptoms. A racing heart, the anxiety, the chest tightness. And then you go on and read about the damage being caused if you figured it out pretty quickly that it was an antibiotic, and you can see that people do in fact die from this drug, and that they are in fact permanently disabled from it from as little as 1 or 2 pills. So I only had 1 pill, and to have that kind of a reaction after 1 pill I knew was a very, very bad thing, and it scared the hell out of me, and I thought that I was going to die. I had accepted my own death, and I was ready for it, and I lived in that condition and that consciousness along with all the pain and the negative emotion for several weeks, several months actually, the first probably 3 months. So this was sustained over a period of time. It wasn't just, it didn't just occur, the symptoms didn't just occur after a few days and stop. They continued. So you can call it PTSD or you can call it complex PTSD. It's up to you to explore this further. I'm going to make this quick video today at 30 minutes. I do have a background in psychology and a master's degree from Marshall University. I practiced mental health for a few years, and I do have friends that have worked in mental health, including a licensed counselor. So I do have some support around me, but whether or not it's a good idea for me to speak to a counselor about this, that's something to consider, and certainly for you as well, because it's going to be, this video is going to be educational, and that's what I'm trying to do with this. So not a lot of treatment and strategies to offer, just a wake-up call to see if you resonate with any of this. So sorry about that tangent, but to come back to where we were, PTSD and complex PTSD, CPTSD, are typically distinguished in terms of duration. So the longer it goes on, the more likely you are to get a complex designation. The severity of it would indicate more PTSD if you had a really severe reaction where you felt like your life was threatened. Now this again doesn't have to be an actual life threat, even though in our case, I think in many of us it was. This can cause aortic aneurysms, it can cause permanent brain damage and lesions, it can cause permanent disability in your connective tissue and in your ankles. So we're really dealing with serious effects from this drug that are more or less the same as a person that went through combat who can die or be permanently disabled. The difference is that when they get done with combat and come back home or come back to the barracks or go on with their life, they're out of that situation, and now they can relive it. We can all relive these traumatic events through flashbacks, but those of us suffering from the mitochondrial toxicity and DNA induction caused by these antibiotics, what this means is that these symptoms can come and go, they can wax and wane, they can come and go in intensity, they can disappear altogether and then resurge from certain foods that we eat. If we take other pharmaceuticals, it could cause a resurgence of symptoms. So there can be serious relapses which can re-trigger all of the same negative emotions and fear and fuel hyperarousal again and pretty much put us right back in the state of fight or flight repeatedly over and over and over and over and over again for weeks, for months, and for years. So I want to make sure that we're heard and validated. This is something psychologically and in many cases physically as severe as combat or a car accident or a violent crime. Well, it's happening to us. The difference is we're laying in bed while it's happening in many cases. So it's really difficult to get your head wrapped around if it's happening to you, and it's going to be difficult for the people that are with you, that love you, that care about you, for them to understand what's going on as well. So anyway, we discussed complex and regular, or PTSD and complex PTSD. So there may be flashbacks for us, and I don't think that's, with the person with combat, they hear firecrackers. It's because they've generalized their anxiety to another stimulus, even though they're no longer in the environment, and they experience a flashback or sudden hyperarousal and a cortisol dump and a splurge of negative emotion. For us, we can generalize our fight or flight response to pharmaceuticals that we take, to supplements that we take, to food that we eat, to too much exercise, to getting out of the car the wrong way and twisting your shoulder and wonder if you've just, ripped your Achilles or ripped your rotator cuff. We stay hyper aroused not so much because we're waiting for something to happen or because something has put us in that condition intermittently or quite randomly, but in many cases for us, we are in that fight or flight state because it is being sustained, often regularly through our own symptoms, because it's our symptoms that can actually trigger fight or flight again. Because if you experience sudden pain in your ankles, and you've read so much about people that ruptured their Achilles tendon, and I was fortunate enough not to be one of those people, but if you are, I'm very sorry about that, and I empathize with you. I had to learn to walk again and was very fortunate. They're still very damaged at 8 months, but because of the fear of this and reading about it, any sort of pain that you get when you suffered the connective tissue issues with this drug, any sort of memory problems that you might have, attention span problems, anything that you notice psychiatrically, any sort of psychiatric symptoms that you notice in your behavior and your emotion or your cognition can literally trigger a fight or flight response, because we're being triggered by our own symptoms, because we don't know what is happening with our body, what it means, what it's going to mean for 5 hours from now, what it's going to mean for tomorrow. Am I even going to be able to go to work? Am I going to be able to get to the grocery store? Am I going to be able to do that thing that I promised my friend I was going to do in a few days? We live, even myself here at 8 months, and now it's tapering down for me, but in a constant state of hyperarousal through my own bodily symptoms due to the reaction to this drug, those symptoms that linger on for months later, in some cases for some people years later. Some people manifest symptoms years later, and it may begin to get worse for them, and that can be extremely terrifying. So it's just different for everybody, and we are being triggered by symptoms in our own body. And it is a very real fear if you've gone through this, because you realize that if you do tear something, or if you have hurt yourself, it could be a week. You may not be able to walk again. Certainly if you're in the acute phase of this in the first few months, you're having suicidal ideations, you have no stress, you can't deal with any kind of stress or stimulation anymore. If this kind of stuff is resonating with you, there is a good chance, if you're in that phase, that you are currently experiencing repeated trauma. And if you've moved out of that phase beyond into several months down the road, then it's no longer an acute stress. It's become a post-traumatic stress. It's after 4 weeks, and it continues to occur in your emotion and in your cognition and in your behavior, in your relationships, and your ability to function. So we've got flashbacks and being triggered by our own symptoms. But this can get very tricky, because then, because of these symptoms, we may begin to generalize, just as a person who has, for example, had an incident in an elevator where the elevator dropped a few floors suddenly, the cable snapped, but nothing happened, the safety mechanism kicked in. Maybe from that point forward, all the elevators that they go on trigger a flashback or re-experience of that trauma. For us, this can be generalized into anything that may produce symptoms. So just because we're no longer taking the antibiotic, if we ate gluten, if we suddenly develop food allergies to nuts and or olives or processed foods or whatever it is, we know that something has changed in the way that our body functions, and foods are causing migraines, or they're causing inflammation, they're causing indigestion. Uh, Anything that's causing a reaction in the body, we can generalize it. So I'm noticing, to flip this around, and the reason this is good to be informative is because a lot of people, I think we are generalizing so much that we are avoiding a lot of supplements. We are avoiding doctors at this point. I've generalized this with my doctors as well because they haven't been any help to me, and that's sort of its own discussion. But to be gaslit by the medical community while you're going through this is kind of what separates us from people who were in car accidents, who were in combat, because we've suffered the same trauma, the same valid psychological and physical harm, but we're literally being invalidated by the community that did it. So we can generalize a lot of, well, I'm kind of moving away from that, but if you feel like the doctors caused this, you may suddenly develop a fear of doctors because of that. You may avoid doctors as a result. So that would be an example. This is a really difficult condition. Many people who suffer trauma, it's sort of accepted by everyone around them that it happened to them, and they understand it, like a combat soldier, somebody in a car wreck, or somebody who was in a violent crime, and that they just don't want to talk about it. And they're kind of given space, and everybody just sort of understands. But with us, because this was done to us legally by medical doctors, in many cases, despite the fact that it's extremely embarrassing to us, in many cases, we were very strong people. We were functional. We worked. We were educated. We were active. I ran a half marathon when I was 38 years old. I lifted weights. I've lost 50 pounds. So for many of us, on one hand, we want to be validated, but on the other hand, we're being invalidated by the people that did it. And I've heard stories of people that have had this condition who went to mental health professionals, such as counselors, and they were further invalidated because the mental health counselors don't know anything about fluoroquinolone toxicity, don't really take it seriously. They may follow up and get a release from you and follow up with your PCP or with the hospital, and those doctors are telling your counselor that it's possibly psychosomatic. They're hearing the word somatization from the practitioner that prescribed this to you, or from the hospital where you went when you couldn't walk. So you may even get invalidated by the counselor that you're going to see, or the psychologist, or the psychiatrist, because they have no idea what they're talking about or what they're dealing about. So this can be extremely difficult for us. It puts us in a catch-22. We can't not talk about it, but on the other hand, we have to talk about it because it's really a difficult situation. So this trauma thing, in the middle of all this, we're under increased stress. Do I talk about it? It's so embarrassing. Or do I not talk about it? But I'm having trouble working. Or I can't be the parent that I used to be. Or I can't be the friend that I used to be. How do you deal with that? All right, so you're talking about a very high probability here that we're going through trauma, a lot of us. Post-traumatic stress disorder following an acute phase of stress. Some of the other symptoms include this form of generalization, from suddenly feeling like the world is no longer a just world. It's not really a fair place. A lot of us carry those constructs with us, that the world is a just world. When this happens to us, and it's happened to us because medical doctors gave this to us, we suddenly may experience a lot of anger, a sudden disillusionment with the medical establishment, with society itself, that this could even happen, even from one pill or from a few scripts, if you took, regardless of how many you had. So you may begin to lose faith in humanity. You may begin to withdraw or to isolate. So this will begin to interfere with your interpersonal relationships and how you function in society. It may change the way you look at everything, even if you had a severe reaction. It can make you feel suddenly very unsafe. And this feeling of unsafety and negative emotion can be generalized into your interpersonal relationships. So it can be extremely difficult to trust people. And this can include your family and your friends and your loved ones. They may not fully understand the severity of the reaction that you had and the effect that it had on you, on your adrenal glands, on your stress response system, to be sustained like that for many months, and that kind of fight or flight response, the effect of that. And as a result, you're having difficulty trusting people. You may isolate, you may withdraw, you may have disturbances in your relationships, you may be out in public and be fearful about people around you whenever you were never like that before. You were always consistent. You were more or less stable, with your ups and downs. But so this is all another effect of trauma from this antibiotic. If it's working its way into your ability to sustain and create new relationships with people at times, you may be dealing with this. This is this is a symptom of PTSD, right? So it's good to be around people that understand. It's important to have people that get what you're going through and that care, even if they don't understand everything. At least they validate your experience and they love you and they're there for you. If you don't have a lot of people like that in your life, then you need to find some support groups online. It's very important to connect with people who are going through this and that can validate your experience when no one else will. So we're talking about generalization and fear and unsafety, and there's no longer a just world, and this sudden total disillusionment with reality itself. That's how devastating the psychological and psychiatric effects of this drug can be, right? We may also, because we're hyper-aroused and we're in a state of fight or flight, because we're constantly experiencing symptoms, we're often in chronic pain, sometimes severe pain, intermittently, we may be very angry. We may have angry outbursts. So it may be uncontrolled. These negative feelings that are in us, or it's depression and the anxiety from the GABA receptor damage from this antibiotic. So there's cortisol elevated in our body. This is just a very difficult situation to be in. Even as you come out of the acute phase and the symptoms begin to abate, you nevertheless will experience a lot of psychological after effects, and this takes the shape of this PTSD, or complex trauma, if you like, at this point. So I think that covers the basics of it. I wanted to make an important, an exclusive video on PTSD alone. I will continue to make my progress videos. I'll probably make another one in a few weeks or maybe in another month or two. I am improving physically. I wish that there was more that I could say. I'm at 8 months. If you're just not getting into this and you feel like your life is never going to be the same again, and you're only at 3 or 4 weeks, or you're now at 2 or 3 months and it's still not really improving, it does get better. It really will improve. For many of us, it did for me, and I felt like I was going to die. Right? I couldn't walk. I had to learn to walk again. I was affected about as severely as you could be. I should have been wheelchaired and in hospice care for a few months, but again, the system didn't deem my condition worthy of the medical attention that I needed, and I was surrounded by doctors who invalidated the cause in the first place. So what I'm saying is I really went through a lot of it, and I've still managed to make it to the 8-month mark through a lot of patience, saw a lot of spirituality, meditation, practicing, stillness, acceptance. Now these can be other videos here as far as how you cope. You may see a psychologist or a counselor if you think that that'll work for you. Be prepared if it doesn't, but that doesn't mean that it won't. There are good counselors in the world. I've worked with some, and I know a few. And if they don't know a condition or they don't understand something, and despite the fact that they call your doctor and get some information back from a medical doctor, they will nevertheless, if they're good and skilled, begin to explore fluoroquinolone toxicity. There are people in your life, hopefully, who are also interested in what's happening to you and will listen to you. But it is very important to get validated. Exercise if you can. I know that's impossible for a lot of us. It was for me early on. Move as much as you can. Obviously watch what you eat. Make sure you get enough sleep if you can, but if you're in that acute phase, I get it. None of this is even possible for you. It's just a complete nightmare. You may explore the use of pharmaceutical drugs to help you sleep, or you may not. You may choose to go natural, melatonin, maybe even drinking might help a bit. I don't know. A lot of people are adamantly opposed to this, but they're okay with that, and other people are opposed to that, and they're okay with it. Just, I guess I'm rambling off here, but you have to find a way to cope with what's happening to you. And you need validated from other people, and if nothing else, you can get that online, and hopefully you have friends and family in your life that will hear you out and be there for you. I do have some good people in my life who have been, and I'm fortunate, but I also had some people who weren't, and some friends who didn't really believe what was happening to me. They didn't think it was nearly as severe as it was, or even that I was faking it, you know. So, but then I got that from the doctors too, you know, that maybe it was being somatized. So I've been through it pretty good, and I guess a lot of you out there have also. So I hope that this video has been helpful. Just trying to relate with you there at the end a little bit about my own personal journey through it. But this trauma stuff is real, and if it's not something that you begin to learn about and to try to cope and treat somehow, then you can carry it with you for years before you realize that even when the symptoms are gone, you may still continue to chalk up your behavior, your cognition, your cognitive problems, your emotional problems, problems in your relationship. Maybe if you're months or years down the road from one of these adverse reaction events, if you're having problems like this, you're still having cognitive problems, you're still having emotional problems, it's very tempting to chalk this up strictly to the biological mechanisms at work in the brain as a result of fluoride poisoning. But there is also, as I said in the last video, the brain's function of adapting to this condition itself, which is the trauma response, where it shuts down and we begin to disassociate frequently and we're not really there and present with people. We have the angry outbursts, we're hyper-aroused, our brain has made a shortcut. That's what it means to be traumatized, to shut it down, right? If this has happened to your brain, then once the physical symptoms begin to improve, you're still left with the psychological trauma and the damage of it, and it will still continue to cause problems for you for months or years down the road. So it would be a good idea to explore this as a possibility for your problems with attention, with memory, with concentration, with emotional regulation, controlling your anger and inhibition. Explore this. Begin to look into the psychological domain as well as the medical or biological domain, because there's a lot of good information, and it's probably best to make sort of a holistic approach rather than something strictly biological and medical. PTSD and complex PTSD induced by an antibiotic reaction. I think that's what a lot of us are dealing with. So thanks for hearing me out. Thanks for hanging around, and I'll make another video soon. Have a good one.